Hello and welcome to my weekly check-in of a year of Brian Eno cultural project, where I'm reading through his diary from 1995, which was published under the title A Year with Swollen Appendices. So in this episode I'm going to be covering the period of February from the 12th to the 18th in the diary, and just pointing up some things I picked up from the diary, rabbit holes I went down, and other things that I've been reminded of that were generally happening in 1995 around that period, outside of his year with swollen appendices, although he didn't have swollen appendices in that year. It's a reference to the book and a colleague. But so stuff that I remember from 95, and then also I'll mention what music I've been listening to which is connected to Brian Eno outside of the 1995 timeline. Another little bit of housekeeping, just a heads up really. I'm going to take a little break on the regular videos for about a week, from a period of Sunday to Sunday. So next Sunday coming and the Sunday after, there won't be any Brian Eno check-ins, but I'll do like a bumper episode on a Sunday after that. So there'll be 3 weeks in that episode. I'm going to explain a little bit more about what'll be coming out when I take my sort of week's break from regular content, nearer to the break. So sometime in this week coming, and I'll just explain exactly what content I am going to be putting up just in the gap. But let's press on with the subject of this video, which is a year with swollen appendices from 1995, the period from 12th to the 18th of February. So there's been quite a few mentions in the book so far of museums in lots of different contexts. On this particular week, he took a visit, a pleasurable visit, with his daughters to the Natural History Museum. And if you're not familiar with where the Natural History Museum is in London, I will include all the links in this episode in the description, but here's Google Maps. So we have I've shown this area of London on previous episodes, or at least one. So you can see we have Hyde Park here, and the Royal Albert Hall, the Science Museum, and here's the Natural History Museum. We've also got Victoria and Albert Museum, Imperial College London, the Royal College of Music. If you zoom in, the Royal College of Art's here. And Eno has quite a lot of connections here generally with the Royal College of Art and the where's it gone? Sorry. The Royal College of Music around here. But this time around, like I said, it was purely a pleasurable visit to the museum. And yeah, it's a great. This whole area is just a great place to wander around. There's actually too much to see here. I remember years ago, on one trip to the Science Museum, I went with a friend and we decided to just spend a day in the Science Museum, and yeah, we didn't even scratch the surface looking round. So, for me, when I visited these more recently on my trips back to the UK, I always know I'm not going to be able to cover anything, so I have to make a choice between a sort of whistle-stop tour to all three, or just go to one and spend a little bit more time than the others. So last time I was in London, I went to the Science Museum, and particularly visited, I think I mentioned in another video I've done, there's a very interesting section there about watches and watchmaking. And no doubt when I come to visit the UK again at some point this year, I will definitely be mooching around this area. It's one of my favourite areas to mooch around. Hyde Park and well, really the area from Paddington, sort of all around here. Very interesting indeed. Another thing that I wasn't expecting in the book, because I didn't know at some point he'd been associated this. So this is the Judge Dredd film from 1995. I much prefer the newer one, Dredd, much darker. But at the time, this was interesting, and I'll tell a little story about this actually. So I can remember this coming out in 95. What I learned from the diary was he'd actually been approached to do some music on this, but turned it down. From reading through here, related to the music, it sounds like there was a lot of readjustment going on generally. Plus there was inclusion, I believe, of songs from various indie, alternate rock, whatever you want to call them, alternative music bands as well, that featured sort of alongside other parts of the score, and a lot of that score actually wasn't used in the film, so it looks like there was a lot of, I don't know what the best word for this will go, but there was a lot of toing and froing going on, and slight shifting on what was going to be included as music in the film. So at some point in that maelstrom, he was approached, but decided not to take it up. But he was involved with some other music, which I'll talk about in this episode. Now, before I forget, the funny connection to this, so I didn't see it when it came out. At that point I was working on a helpline in an accounts office. We were doing support for electronic point of sale, and we used to go in on a Saturday to provide coverage, and I would get a day off in the week, and it worked really well for me because at that point I was doing my postgrad in computing and manufacturing. So what I would do is it was nice during the week because is quiet in the house for studying, so I'd take Wednesday off as my day off in the week and work all day Saturday. We were on flexi time, so it's really good for swapping time around. So I'd do all my Open University studies, most of them on the Wednesday. I would take stuff into work as well to read during breaks. But anyway, so we'd be in on a Saturday with, I think, 3 out of 6 of us, sort of half the staff, and it was normally pretty quiet on a Saturday, even though all of the shops were open. I think a lot of them didn't realise we were there to provide till support, and will leave all their problems till Monday. And what happened was, because it was a bit quiet, one week I'd gone in when I wasn't working, and they'd got the TV out of the there was a big room in the area we were working in where they did talks and presentations and management meetings, and there was a TV in there. So I'd gone in the previous week. I wasn't working the previous week, I don't think, but I'd just gone shopping in town, and when I did that I'd go in and say hi to everybody because I really love working there and really love the people that work there. And so we'd often pop in at the weekend to say hi even when we weren't working, and hang out for half an hour chatting. Anyway, they'd taken the TV out, had the aerial hanging out the window, and were watching at some point, and this, I don't think this was 95, this might have been 96 or later, and we're watching, what was it now? There was that big outdoor festival, one of the big outdoor music festivals, watching that. And anyway, so the following week when I was working, the guy that was in charge of the team leader said, "Oi, should we all chip in and go and rent the new Judge Dredd film?" Because none of us had seen it. the one with Sylvester Stallone. And so we said, okay then. So we got the TV out again, and we're watching the video on this TV. Anyway, because no one used to come in like management higher than my team leader. And anyway, there's one occasion the office manager came in, and we were watching this. And the funny thing is, she didn't say anything at the time, but then on Monday this memo went round to everybody, reminding them not to misappropriate company property, and nothing was ever said to us. We were never disciplined or anything, but there was just this sort of anonymous memo. It didn't mention anybody had contravened anything, and I found it a really interesting way of handling things, because we didn't do it again. It served its purpose, but none of us got told off, or there wasn't any sort of inquiry. But it was a really interesting way of doing it. So yeah, so when I think about that film, I always remember sitting in the office, taking calls and watching Judge Dredd in the background. Another thing he mentions is around about this time there was part of a trilogy of books. The second one, I think this was, the book was called The Evolution of Consciousness by Robert Ornstein. I think it must have come out in maybe 93, 94, so before the diary. But obviously he was either in the process of reading it or got around to reading it. And this, I believe, was before it, and then this one came after. It's funny how reading through the diary, there's all these random things he mentions, random sort of musings and thoughts, a bit like the sort of things I have, and reflecting on stuff, just completely randomly. And he actually he's talking about, in the diary, he talks about the United States Space Command and how they're responsible for monitoring space debris. And he makes a point of, I think, mentioning the amount of debris that at the time was up there in space. And let me just open up my notes that I'm taking. So I did make a note here of, so I mentioned here that he realised that Space Command were tracking 7,000 objects from 10 centimetres upwards, and that was on the 17th of February. That was his entry. So I looked up online, and apparently now they're tracking 47,000 objects, and there's actually plans to transfer that responsibility to the Department of Commerce. But at the time the diary was written, and well, it's still the case now, the United States Space Surveillance Network is under the responsibility of the United States Space Command, and now actually is operated by the US Space Force, which had only relatively come into operation in the last couple of years, actually, last 2 or 3 years. But it's interesting to think how much. I mean, I was aware of how much space garbage there is up there, but the amount's not getting any smaller. And I'm sure, just in the space of me putting up this video, it's probably, gone up from around 47,000 to a figure much larger. So, and I'll include a link here so you can read about how they've tracked that over the years, because that must be some serious piece of equipment and software and various other things that monitors all of that. Also, an interesting reference to work he's doing on some Derek Jarman. So Derek Jarman had passed away in 1994, so the year before this book, and the reference in the diary is specific to some music he's working on. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, Glitterbug. So this is a 1-hour compilation film of various Super 8 shorts with music by Brian Eno. So he did some music for that. Now that list is coming out in 94. It's interesting he's talking about it in 95. So I think what's happening is he's sort of reflecting on the film after the fact in there. Now the other reason why I wanted to bring this up is there's a bit of overlap here, interesting enough, with stuff I'm listening through at the moment. So as part of a completely separate ongoing project, which I've mentioned in a video that's not connected with this, to do with, I think sometime last year I mentioned I was going through that 1001 Albums Before You Die podcast, and we started off, myself and my wife, from 1978. So we're into 79 now, and we're listening to the albums. And one of the albums we listened to actually this week, just gone, was Marianne Faithfull's Broken English. And I had no idea that Derek Jarman was actually involved with the videos for those. I knew he'd done some, videos over the years for various bands that I'm familiar with. So Pet Shop Boys, obviously stuff with the Sex Pistols, Lords of the New Church, Psychic TV and Throbbing Gristle, Mark Ormond, the Smiths, some work with them. But I had no idea he did 3 videos for Marianne Faithfull around the period of that, the release of that album. I probably, in terms of his work, I'm probably more familiar with the period here. And I did know that Toyah Willcox was actually in The Tempest. And I'm trying to remember if that was her big break in acting or not. Because my understanding is that she was an actress before she got famous as a musician, but it could be that the two lined up. Oh, there we go. No, it looks like... Just looking here quickly because I hadn't planned to talk much about this. But yeah, it looks like her music releases were just outside of, just after. It's almost Quadrophenia was 79. Yeah, so maybe it was sort of in parallel. So I wonder whether it was Quadrophenia more that was seen as her big role around that time that really sort of thrust her into the limelight. Although it does mention about Jubilee as well. Oh, there we go. Yeah. A play with Noel Edmonds and Phil Daniels. Okay. But yeah, Toyah Willcox, another very interesting artist, performer. She's done a lot of different things. Now she's got a very successful YouTube channel. But yeah, someone else well worth going down a rabbit hole. Though he hasn't specifically mentioned her so far. But as I was mentioning Derek Jarman, I thought it'd be interesting to mention one of the actresses who's clearly been involved in several of his works. So yeah, video game releases. I remember this coming out because I remember demos for this appearing on cover CDs. So this was this Star Wars Dark Forces first-person shooter video game, very much fitted in alongside all the Doom stuff and Duke Nukem that was coming out at that time, and all the other things that were using the Doom engine. I'm not sure what engine they actually used for this. Maybe it looked like they might have developed their own one. It certainly said that expands the standard set by Doom in 93. I don't know if it does give the engine there or not. Mentions the PlayStation as well. Wow, easy to forget that was released way back then, 94. But yeah, a lot of stuff around that time, often called a Doom clone. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that around that time either used the Doom engine or was inspired by, or uses the Jedi game engine, this one. What does that say there? Very similar. Huh. And then music-wise, I realised after I recorded last week's episode, I did miss out a few albums that came out in last week's time period. So I've included, I think I got up to sort of Slow Dive. And I also checked something. So Brian Eno was actually involved with the previous Slow Dive album. Not Pygmalion, but the previous one. But I mention this because, of course, it just coincides release-wise with the timeline, because all of these, I'm doing this, obviously, as you know, this list in Spotify of all the albums chronologically that come out in the timeline, or the timeline window, as I'm covering them in these weekly check-ins. And I had missed out from last week Stratovarius' Fourth Dimension and Carter the Unstoppable Sex Machine Worry Bomb. In the UK, it was interesting when Carter the Unstoppable Sex Machine, who were a two-piece, came out. There was an interesting little, what would you call it, quirk in the live performance rules to do with bands playing music at certain live venues. And due to, at the time, the way that whole performance laws to do with copyright and to do with, well, royalty payments actually, there was an interesting quirk about two pieces, and Carter the Unstoppable Sex Machine were two pieces, and I saw around that time a lot of other two pieces start up, because I could believe at the time I think a two-piece band could play at venues that didn't have weren't licensed with the UK music licensing agency, and then the name, I forget the name, but it's this thing where you have to be licensed so that they can collect performance royalties. But there was at times some quirk about two-piece bands didn't count for some reason under the law around that time. So it was interesting when I was going to various live venues to suddenly see all of these two-piece bands where you had, and they were modern. It wasn't the case of it was like, a guy on an organ with a female singer, the sort of classic setup that you often get at a lot of holiday camps and various other institutions in the UK where you might go and see, have music on in the background. This was actually more, rock-based stuff or dance-based stuff where you might have someone operating a keyboard or a synth or a sequencer, and then a second member maybe also playing guitar and singing, or maybe just someone singing with this electronic backing track. So yeah, that reminds me very much of that period in live music in the UK where the lineups of bands actually pared down to exploit certain holes in the music licensing rules for live venues. Now the week that it covers, we've got this album, which was this Slash's first solo album, I think. His solo projects have gone under some different names, and I did see him live with, was it the Conspirators? Sometime in the 2010s, I think, if I'm right, yeah, in Nova Scotia after I moved here. And he had a pretty cool backing band at that point. First Nevermore album, The Rapture by Susan the Banshees, No Protection by Massive Attack, which is actually a remix album but it's so different from the originals. I thought it was worth mentioning. And Cheshire Cat by Blink 182, which is their debut studio album. I mean, I'm sure I've mentioned this numerous times before, but yeah, 95. There's this sort of these periods in 1990s, particularly. Well, one of them is 95, where you just get this string of really cool albums coming out, and also the sort of birthing of all these genres, or the development of these genres. You know, you can see in 95, and I've spoken about it before, we've got trip hop stuff happening around that time, but then there's all this sort of UK indie and stuff coming from the US off the back of grunge, and other bands staging a bit of a resurgence. We've got from over in Europe, we've got sort of melodic death metal. We've got the tail end of shoegaze and various other things. Bands who've been around for a long time, maybe releasing greatest hits or albums that are quite different from anything they've released up to that point as well. So, yeah, interesting times. So while we're talking about music, this is what the top 10 singles charts looked in that week. So you can see, if you've watched previous episodes, there's a lot of stuff still kicking around in the singles charts from previous weeks I've covered. And then moving further up into the top 20. So in terms of the new entries that week in the top 20, we've got Everlasting Love by Gloria Estefan, Man-Sized Rooster by Supergrass. There's also some stuff bubbling under as well that's quite interesting. We got CNC Music Factory, Go-Go's, Basket Case by Green Day is going down the charts. And that had been released a lot earlier in the year, the previous year, from what I remember. And as a consequence, you were seeing, that the popularity of that sort of building from the previous year and then spilling over into 95. So I'm just checking here. Yeah, so 94. So there's a lot of momentum from 94 that spilled over into 95 as well. Album wise, yeah, I think we've seen quite a few of this stuff in previous weeks. There's Worry Bomb by Carter USM. So that, Carter USM were doing really well in this period. A few years prior to this, and this album just flew into the charts the moment it was released. We got Leftism by Left Field, which had come out a couple of weeks earlier, and then all the other stuff that I've spoken about previously are still bubbling around. Dookie by Green Day, still up there. Best of by Sting, the Best of by Bon Jovi, and then just outside of the top 20. So you can get an idea. There's a previous Massive Attack album they released before the remix album. So of course some of those tracks, the remixes off of there, turn up. And then I've updated the Spotify lists and included the stuff that I missed as well on the 95 one. So in terms of where I've got to listening through all the stuff that Brian Eno was involved with, either he produced or was his solo output or was collaborations, we've got Acton Baby by U2. We've got a Jeffrey Orima album. We have and a couple of Brian Eno solo albums as well. So that's where and that list I'm listening out to outside of this timeline. So I'm just working through that. So just to put it in place with that, with his output and his collaborations and his productions, we're up to around, this would be 1992. So I'm actually getting into the time frame, and then I'll be going out the other side. But in terms of the 95 albums generally that came out in that period, I've added the ones I mentioned to my Spotify playlist, so Stradivarius, Carter, USM. There was another album, Hanky Panky, Slash's Snake Pit, Nevermore, Susie and the Banshees, and in fact, let me just remove those because they're not doing anything there. Obviously, they haven't got rights to play those. No Use for a Name. I forgot to mention that band. I was more familiar with them from the NRA period because I got a sampler when I subscribed to, I think it was Terrorizer magazine, the first time I subscribed for a year. I got a really cool No Use for a Name sampler. They do some pretty cool covers of other songs. There's a medley of covers actually on this album. But the one that I was most familiar with is they did a cover of Truth Hits Everybody by the Police that was included on this compilation album. And then we got Massive Attack and Blink 182. So there we have it. That's my weekly check-in for me reading through Brian Eno's diary, A Year with Swollen Appendices, which covers the period 1995. Thanks once again for watching. Bye for now. And I'll catch you in the next episode.